been trying to understand is how we've ended up here today in terms of the nature of Spring Hill, its community, its built structure, and so on. And so some of our learnings are definitely applicable to wide areas. And I suppose in general terms, most people today find it very difficult to understand how the space around them is being constructed. And it forms our views on the world in a way that is much deeper than we think. So understanding how the space is created is really important to us. And what we've tried to do is take a very broad-based view. So with that in mind, I'd like to start by recognising the traditional owners of this land and Spring Hill, the Turrbal tribe, and pay respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and recognise that the land, water, and landscape of the Spring Hill area are traditional landscapes that were spiritually and sustainably managed for thousands of years by the Turrbal tribe to provide the resources required for life. Much of what we've done since 1824 has been to, in its own particular way, obliterate some of that history. And so in terms of looking at the Spring Hill area, what we've tried to do is look at the long run, and it's a group effort, and there are lots of different layers and elements that go into that. And so Beverly and I and others in the community all have different perspectives and aspects that we look at. And what we're trying to do is pull it together into something that is capable of helping us to understand, but also helping others around us to understand. So we've got some material that we've collected. Some of it's in this slide, but also I've made available to the Geographic Society our full report. So sitting behind this presentation, there is a long report which is fully referenced and which provides a lot more detail than we're going to cover this morning. And so if you were interested, both the presentation, which is hyperlinked, so there are references in the presentation which you can click on that will take you to the source material, and there's also a more detailed report. So with that in view, I might start and go through the presentations here. One of the things that we learned in this process, and this is a view of Spring Hill that was there about 18 months ago when I took it, but it's gone. And I suppose that's part of what we're talking about, that the landscape is changing very regularly and very consistently. And what we've discovered as part of doing this particular presentation is the word toponym. I don't know if anyone's heard the word toponym before, but topo comes from the Greek place, and nym is what you put on the end of something for name. So it's place name. And so naming places, as it turns out, is a significant aspect of not only writing history, but writing out history. And so the names that are used in a suburb create a history, but they also hide another one. And that's part of the interest in terms of trying to look at the longer perspective. From that view that we just looked at on the prior slide, we would have been able to see this in 1824 or a little bit after that. And it's a meeting between two young ladies and a couple of First Nations people. And that was at Kangaroo Point. And that was an indication of what you would have seen if you were standing on that point where we had the previous photo and we were looking out towards the Story Bridge, we would have seen that as the picture of what Brisbane looked like in the 1820s to 1830s. I'm not sure how much of you have ever read poetry, but T.S. Eliot's reference that I've put up on the screen is something that I've known for many, many years. And it's really about learning causes you to look at the place you're looking at anew. But after all of these years of knowing that quote, I had never really taken much notice of the fact that the second last line comes through the unknown remembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. So in a sense, what we're trying to do in the Spring Hill project is to take off our current day glasses and have a look at it from its long past and try to understand why it is the way that it is today. And so some of that learning is hopefully in the next presentation. I don't want you to read what's on the screen there other than just to alert you to the fact, and Neville has already said that. We've been working on a Spring Hill vision for the last few years. And the object of that was that we discovered standing in front of a site with a sign complaining about what was going to be built there was pretty useless. And we started to realise that if we'd wanted to object to what was going to happen there, we would have needed to be standing there 5 or 6 years earlier, because the system is a system that works its way through a level, a hierarchy, a nested hierarchy. And so we've been slowly working our way through the Commonwealth hierarchy, the state hierarchy, the Brisbane City Council hierarchy, and the neighbourhood hierarchy of planning to try and understand what was going on. And that's really why we're at this particular point in time of trying to understand Spring Hill. And in this next section, I'm going to introduce you to a few terms that will probably annoy you, but it's really important to try and lay some foundation here about how we are going to think about the space that is being created around us and the space that is becoming that our children and our children's children will be living in. And the first annoying term is geotechnical milieu. Now, what on earth am I trying to talk about? Geo is geographical, it's place. Technical is what some people call techniques, other people might call technology, other people might call it computers or tools, etc. And milieu is the living system around it. So what the term is endeavouring to say is there needs to be a place, there are technical things in that place, no matter where you go, and there's also life, human life, natural life, living matter, etc. So that's the sphere, that's what we're calling Spring Hill. It's a geotechnical milieu. And what we've discovered is to understand it, you need to look and understand a few terms. And these are even going to be more annoying. But I really would like you to be patient with me for a moment so that when we go through some of this other material, you can see how it might influence the way you think about a suburb. We're using a process called cultural historical activity theory, which is based on making sure that you don't look at one particular thing. You look at the things that are in the environment, you look at the documents, you talk to the people, you've got to look at everything. So that's that first term. The next thing is ecology, and most of you will be aware that really is about relationships within an environment. A technical object, it could be this computer, it could be this microphone, it could be a building, it could be a street sign, it could be a book, it could be ChatGPT. But what we know for sure and for certain is that we don't control everything about the technical objects. The technical objects are also influencing us. And therefore, it's really important to understand then the next term, which is quasi-causality. It means that we're not the boss of the tools. The technical objects are influencing how we think every day by what information they present to us. So reality is being caused and having a backward cause. In the 50s, when they were talking about cybernetics, Norbert Wiener said, humans have changed the environment so much that we've now got to change ourselves. And that's what's happening to us every day. We are being influenced and caused to be different because of the technical objects we're interacting with. And when it comes to place, I was talking to a young person a couple of weeks ago who'd newly come to Brisbane, and for the first couple of weeks, her phone was out of action. And so she had to find out where to go, and she had to find out street names. After a couple of weeks, she got a phone back and she started interacting with her friends. And she said, oh, I'll meet you on the corner of Allison and Edward. Do they meet? Yes, they do. Alice and Edward. And she said, she was talking to the locals and they said, well, where's that? They don't know. We don't know. Well, I think this gentleman would.
You have a seat if you want.
No, I'm right. I'm right.
Move off the side of the screen.
No, I'm watching the screen.
If you hop over this way, I think they.
No.
I might.
Yeah. Okay. And so that's just one little example. This is not just a one-way street. Technology is coming back and causing us to be different. And you've got to be aware of that, because the next one is state space. And state space is really, some people describe it to me as building spreadsheets in the sky. So when the First Nations people lived here and when we first Europeans arrived here, basically we were constrained by the size of the footprint. Over the next 200 years, we've broken those shackles, and we've actually created new space, and it's state space. And the state causes there to be rules that determine what you can do in the space above land. And in fact, they're now talking about value capture of space, because they're selling for real money the space that sits above a railway line and that sort of thing. And legislation and material changes in the way in which we regulate planning have been dramatically changed in order to be able to create the rules and regulations of state space. And it's the basis on which this neighbourhood has changed from, I'll call them humpy-style dwellings, be they First Nations or Europeans, to now we've had a zoning at Kurilpa where the Lord Mayor has indicated that the only limit is the aeroplanes. So the buildings that they put up at Kurilpa can go as high as they like, provided they don't get in the road of any jets.
Well, they don't wash away in the flood. What about the store? That's development. Queen's, I don't know what the, somebody help me.
Queen's Wharf.
Queen's Wharf.
Yeah.
Is high, isn't it?
Yes.
That's not interfering with air.
No, I think the Meriton buildings are already probably 70, 75. Yeah. Whereas with Kurilpa, they're saying there is no limit. So it's the technology. in terms of the flooding, it's a very valid point, because I don't know whether you've ever listened to Margaret Cook, who's a local historian, has written a book, and the book is called The River with a City Problem. And my understanding is that when the white fellas came here, the First Nations people said to us, the water will tell you where the land is. And based on Margaret's research, they were convinced that it could never stop them from building, because they weren't used to an Australian environment that works the way ours does. They assumed they could control nature, and that nature was there as a free resource for us to be able to exploit. Okay, I better keep going because it gets worse. Exosomatisation, and you go, man, oh man, we came here to talk about Spring Hill. Exosomatisation. It's really an extension of the last couple of points. But what it means in practical terms is human life is now evolving outside of human beings. So the technology is now evolving with learning that we aren't actually participating in. So at the moment, the machines, and this is not, I'm not meaning to scare anyone by this. It's just that we've got to understand that young people are growing up with more machine memories than actual memories. And that when they recollect about something, they say, oh, that's just like what's on YouTube. It's not the other way around. It's what's coming from the machines that's causing us to have the memories, particularly with younger people who are spending hours and hours on it. And that just doesn't apply to technology like screen technology. It actually applies to most of the technologies in place that we just talked about the capacity that we can build essentially as high as we can. Why? Because we've got the technology, and the technology is capable of putting us into a totally different space. And all of those things are conjoining in a simple little place called Spring Hill or in your suburb. And it's having a big impact on us. The next one is sort of connected to that, intonation. And I really think it's very well illustrated by some of the historical events over the last couple of days. The point that intonation is trying to convey is that all of a sudden the local is connected to the global. Now, when we were growing up, we were mainly influenced by what was happening in our suburb, or what our parents told us to do, or what we were told at school. And when we went to school, most of the teachers knew what was going on. None of those circumstances apply today. And I'm not meaning to be critical of educators, but there's so much that we don't know, and they can't be expected to know all of it as well. And so going forward, the major changes in the world are most likely to come from local initiatives that get connected globally, that make a difference. And so in spite of all of the problems that we're having locally, what I would like to say from our learnings is the local is even more important now, even though when you walk down the street, you wouldn't think that many people knew where they were, because they're generally engaged in some interaction with a machine, and the circumstances don't matter, and people work from home in Bangkok and are in a call centre in Melbourne. All of these things mean that place becomes a very different perspective. But don't underestimate the capacity now for local to make a big difference. And in that regard, net gain sustainable development is about development that increases biodiversity, that increases social well-being, and increases economic sharing. And it's real, and there is the potential for it. And essentially, we know that's what suburbs like ours are looking for, something whereby we can look after our environment and look after our neighbours and get on with having a good, healthy, active life. And the last one there is the one that I spoke about earlier, toponymic inscription. Essentially, naming things is a part of changing history or creating history. And so that's a long-winded introduction. And so now I suppose, hopefully, this might become a little more interesting in terms of what's actually happening or has happened. And a lot of words there. I found this summary from Rod Fisher, who is a very well-recognised Queensland historian. And in 3 paragraphs, he summarised what was happening in Spring Hill. This is in the early 2000s. And essentially what he's saying is, first paragraph, when people arrived here, they thought it was a pretty beautiful place. As things went on, it was all okay, but all of a sudden there seemed to be less well-being and lots of high-rise buildings. And his final summary is, well, you know, we've got to look after the past, respond to the present, and consider the future. And I suppose, in a nutshell, I suspect that's why you guys meet every now and again and read and interact with one another. In essence, this summarises a couple of years of work. What we've discovered is that initially, pre-1824, when Oxley and others came here, essentially the people that lived here lived in the country. They were a part of it, and we'll have a look at why we say that. When we came along, essentially we dropped a sheet with rectangles over the landscape, and we chopped it all up into little pieces, and we had a whole economic system that put value in pieces of land that were, let's say, disenfranchised from the country. And at the moment, we're on a very, very clear, very well-resourced pathway to end up living in a place which is nowhere in particular and very similar to what's happening in many other places. What we've discovered is that the First Nations people that lived here have a continuing influence on everything that's happened in Spring Hill. And their technology and their connection with the land was incredibly strong. And so when we started looking at, you know, our streets and our roadways and our pathways and the construction of our subdivisions, what we started to see is it was all based on the frame of reference that we had when we arrived. And so this is not a place that's been created by us. We've done a lot of damage, but it's a place that's based on us using the knowledge and information of the first people. And in fact, the structure of Spring Hill demonstrates it very clearly. This is a map produced by lots of research over time, and essentially the bit in the middle that is called Mariel, stepmother, is essentially where we are. And so the upside down U's are campsites, the crosses are fighting sites, and the little dots are original pathways. And what we will later look at is the extent to which the structure of most of those things are still in place. And the big squiggle down the middle is the Brisbane River. And to the north of that, there's a reference to, I'll say, the Duke of York's clan. And the Duke of York was the leader of the Turrbal clan on the north side of Brisbane. And leadership for them was not something that was established through elections. It wasn't established through authority. It was established through connection with people and wisdom in the broadest sense of the word. There was no genuine authoritarian frame of reference. Everyone was expected to be responsible, and the assumption was that you shared everything that there was. And some of what we've learned is some of the problems that arose early on with some of the younger First Nations people were so angry and upset about the white fellas not being prepared to share the proceeds. And in those early years, the Europeans depended heavily on the First Nations people to gain enough food. And in fact, there's a suggestion that the reason that we moved the initial settlement from Redcliffe up to here, not only were there geographical and environmental issues, but it was also that the Duke of York, who was, his Aboriginal reference was Daki Yaka, and we just happened to change his name just so that it suited our history and called him the Duke of York. There's a bit of similarity there in the way that you described them. But like most of our naming, it seemed to go either to royalty or to the male lineage. And we've been surprised because Bev's got lots of records in regard to titles around the territory. And what we've found is that even though it was the female whose name was on the title, they were never, ever mentioned in any of the dealings or any of the transactions. And from what we can ascertain, none of the names were ever based on even female surnames. So I suppose the point I'm making there is that the Aboriginal cultural environment was a matri-moiety environment where the matriarchal line was a significant element of how they passed on lots of their knowledge and lots of their, let's say, ancestral framework. Whereas we, the Europeans, came from a very patriarchal environment, which caused us to be the way that we are. Look, what I wanted to say under language and culture is I've said a few things about it, but interestingly enough, the Aboriginal nations or cultural blocks were based on ecology. And what anthropologists have established over recent years is that, in fact, the Brisbane-based tribes were connected with the riverine block that runs up from not quite the Murray mouth, but runs up the Murray River system, and its only entry to the coast on the east coast is through Brisbane. And so there was a cultural block that their language and their customs and their engagement with one another was framed in concert with the environment. And so the language changed depending on the ecology, and it was the ecology that framed the human organisation, not the other way around. And we struggle in planning terms nowadays because we draw straight lines through things, and you know, the basin or the source of a river, which causes a whole range of things to happen through country, is now broken up. And you can see how successful we've been with the Murray River in making sure that everyone gets a fair share. So I suppose the point that we've learned is the First Nations culture was complex and sophisticated and in no way backward. It was different, and it was different because of circumstances that caused it to be. And there are loads of them in terms of going back to the quasi-causality issue. The way people developed was framed around the circumstances they found themselves in. And it goes to everything, the climate, the animals, the trees, all of that influenced why we ended up being able to be superior. And maybe some of you have heard of the guns, germs and steel thesis from Jared Diamond. But essentially, he was walking along the beach in Papua New Guinea one day with a Papuan, and he couldn't believe how capable, astute and intelligent his colleague was. And yet here he was, a professor from a US university, had everything. And he then looked at the history of European prevalence, and he wrote a book called Guns, Germs and Steel. And basically it was the nature of the factions out of Europe developing warlike tendencies, developing the capacities, increasing their population, having diseases. And when they came to places like North America, South America, Australia, they killed more people with the diseases they brought with them than they did, but the guns and the steel helped. This is just some photos of those Brisbane First Nations people, and there were loads of them. And this is a group on the river. And from the best that we can ascertain, around Spring Hill, at certain times, there were probably 800 people living in the area, particularly when they had groups coming together for certain events. There was extensive trade in southeast Queensland. There was extensive interaction, and you've probably all heard of the Bunya Festival. I mean, there were multiple intersocial relationships, and there were sophisticated mechanisms for them to be able to engage with one another. And so they were an intelligent, capable people who probably helped the Europeans as much as they fought with them. And part of why we seem to have picked Brisbane was that under Daki Yaka's leadership, they weren't as hostile as the others. And we don't know enough about it, but we conject that maybe their connection with that riverine block caused them to be slightly less aggressive in response to our interventions. And what we do know is that Daki Yaka on many occasions intervened between the parties. And so he was a true leader in the sense that he was able to consider the potential of being able to ameliorate engagement. There has been quite a bit of contention in the communities around Brisbane. And in fact, you're probably aware that any native title claim has been expunged here. And so within the groups, there is between the Yugara and the Turrbal some friction, and that friction arises because they didn't have fixed boundaries, and language groups and local groups and ownership weren't all neatly tied together in a package. And that with every clan or tribe, someone was responsible for virtually every natural item in their area. So people had totems, they understood what that species did and meant, and
Yeah,
they were sources of knowledge.
That's that'll be the closest one. You know where we went last time? Oh, what was wrong with that?
I think someone might be not on mute.
Yeah, well, we'll see.
Hello? Could you go on mute, please? Okay, they're always listening.
It's interesting that the Colonial, which is on the edge, all around North Straddie, they put a claim in many years ago, the whole of Brisbane, and a bit of Brisbane history. The local council didn't bother to publicise it. The state member has responded, and the federal member for that part of Metropolitan Brisbane.
Okay.
But they made a blanket claim, which has been now brought back to 3,500 lots, and they're claiming individual residential lots.
Okay.
It's the first urban claim in southeast Queensland.
Right. So the High Court judgment in regard to their claim is based on the fact that native title requires there to be a clear continuity of engagement, and essentially I'll say that it's close enough to any area that was the subject of that Geographical claim is no longer capable of being put forward. So this must, I assume, must be on the edge of that.
Yeah, just outside the Geographical.
Yeah.
Well, the Geographical claim right to the other side of the strategy.
Yeah.
But the Colonial claim only that area, which is residents and a little bit east of Brisbane.
Right. So when we were looking at roads and pathways and so on, we started to look at how it worked, because when people come together and you don't have a strong relationship in regard to ownership, how does one group get there and come back again, and how do you organise it? And this is work that was provided by one of the Petries who were involved in Brisbane in the early days. And he explains how sophisticated the process was, in that where you camped, where you were visiting Brisbane, was resolved, and then where you went to hunt while you were camped there was resolved. And there were rules also for the pathway, the use of the pathways, that you couldn't go too far off the pathway, you needed to be there. So even though their system wasn't stringent in regard to boundaries and so on, there were quite sophisticated arrangements made so that they didn't unnecessarily have arguments about property rights. And essentially then their fighting sites were to some degree a controlled level of engagement for them to get to know one another enough and hopefully not kill each other too often, which seems like a fairly humane process. So just to connect with that idea, there are pretty established trade routes, and I think for me it's very interesting. If you look halfway up the east coast, the line goes down along the Murray River to that point between South Australia and Victoria. So the idea that these people were just hunter-gathering and that they didn't have a sophisticated social system is a long way off the track. These next two slides, has anyone seen the Dark Emu series, which talks about the knowledge that was contained within the songlines and other things? Essentially, what people have now realised is that the First Nations people were able to use the connection with the stars to actually connect the directions on the pathways, which they also used to help to train their younger people in the environment along the pathways. So the song lines was a highly sophisticated mechanism for connecting the cosmic with the local, that it enabled people to remember that when you got to that tree or that edge of the creek and you had your pathway with the stars, you would take a right-hand turn, and in the process, they would then use various mechanisms to remember the features that were in that area. So that the level of learning is described as that when we came here, we thought we were the first ones mapping it. In fact, the First Nations archive was in the country. It was built into their whole social system, so that the social system was designed to know how to travel across the country, to know what was in the country, and to know how to respond with other people if you're passing through their country. That's a very sophisticated context. And it's not surprising that that's a map, and it's really compressed from the point of view of just trying to, that concentration in the middle is really the Brisbane River. And so the decisions that we made were based on the fact that there was already a significant population surviving on the natural resources. And so it was a pretty good place to start to try and build a community, because in many instances there are records of the Aboriginal people fishing at the mouth of the Breakfast Creek and catching many, many fish and providing it to the white population. And so in many contexts, there was an almost necessity that we couldn't have done what we did without the support of those people. And Daki Yaka's connection with white people started from the very beginning, when Oxley first came in to the Brisbane River. And if you work on the basis that Spring Hill sort of starts at Wickham Terrace there, and it's a ridge above the river, and if you imagine that there's nothing between you and the river, then Oxley was referring to the fact that they encountered Daki Yaka's people very early, and there were multiple interactions where the Turrbal clan weren't too aggressive in regard to working with and helping the settlers. So that the area of Spring Hill, which from our point of view previously was called Spring Hollow, abuts then Victoria Park, which was then by the white people called York's Hollow, being the Duke of York. So it's Daki Yaka's hollow that they're talking about. And there was extensive interaction between Daki Yaka's clan and the white people early on, and his role in leadership seems to us to have been quite an important element as to why Brisbane was able to get off the ground, because there was clearly a time when there were more First Nations people here than there were Europeans. And if they had chosen a certain pathway, it could have had a different consequence. Okay, from in to on. This first map is just to indicate that the two red lines are essentially Gregory Terrace as the top one, and the next one down is Leichhardt Street stroke St Paul's Terrace. And essentially, the pattern of their settlement has become the pattern of Spring Hill. And if we go a bit further, what I've marked up there is that the black ones are the east-west lines through Spring Hill, and the red ones are the north-south lines. And the black ones have essentially followed the pathways that the First Nations people used, and they're still the primary arterials that skirt Spring Hill. To get that in a different perspective, if you imagine the contours of Spring Hill like that wave, then the little black dot at the top is that the Gregory Terrace, the Boundary Street, the Leichhardt Street, and the Wickham Terrace are all built on the top of the hills. And there are then these connecting streets which have always struggled, because the blue on the left-hand side was essentially what is now Water Street, that used to be called Spring Hollow, because it's where all the water ended up. And when we started building houses on the side of the slopes, it all started to foul up. And in 1902, we had a great bout of the plague. So I suppose it would be fair to say that this is not me talking on this slide. It's the history, it's the true historians. Rather than white towns like Brisbane expunging and replacing Aboriginal geography, many appear to have grown beside or even from Aboriginal campgrounds. Why this should be so is not as surprising as might seem. In fact, it is even possible to think of Brisbane having a competitor for its hegemony in the early days. White pioneers required the same resources as the Aboriginal people. A large, healthy campsite with great indication that such resources were at hand. It was simpler to reside at a readily habitable place with a good supply of water and rework current pathways than to attempt to hack one's way into unknown scrub or eke out a living in an area even Aboriginals did not seem to populate. So I suppose this next map is our canny way of dealing with all of that. This is the 1842 survey. What we discovered was that the writing instructions, even before the governor came to New South Wales, the writing instructions were that you must have a group of surveyors and you must be ready to cut up the land, which is code for we want to make money out of slicing up the land as soon as we have control of it. So any idea that a lot of our interactions were unintentional and just, let's say, as a result of two cultures meeting one another and not getting on, the plan before they arrived assumed they would be taking it, slicing it up, and using it to make money. And essentially then to come back to the native title claim, by putting a boundary around it, it gave them policing role, which they then employed to move the Aboriginals progressively out of that area. And we were able to design it such that where we cut across the Brisbane River there in two places, at Kangaroo Point and towards Toowong, inside both of those boundaries happened to be pathways that at that time the First Nations people were able to cross the river at low tide. So we essentially made sure that we disrupted their general economy as much as possible from 1842. And that was done as soon as the penal colony closed down there was a bit of an argument about how they were going to do that. But as soon as it closed down, they got the surveyors in and they started slicing and dicing. We did.
Well, a lot of it's a 20th century stuff. It's not like that. Huge.
Right. Yeah.
On the 20th century stuff.
Okay. Neville, how am I going for time? Okay. So the original slicing up essentially was into 2-acre lots across the lot. And it's hard to see that, but the middle of Spring Hill was called Spring Hollow, and we eventually turned it into Water Street, which I thought was a cute way of changing the naming. We then are able to show you from the 2-acre blocks, essentially by the mid-1870s. So this started in late 1850s. By 1870, Queensland was created in 1859, and one of the first pieces of legislation that needed to be implemented was the Undue Subdivision Act, because in Spring Hill, these 2-acre blocks over less than 20 years were being sold as 6 perch blocks.
6 perch.
6 perch. And we have a photo of Mrs. Long's house that prompted the legislation. So essentially, across Spring Hill, what we've been able to do initially was, because we didn't have state space and we had to deal with the footprint, essentially we just started slicing and dicing, and it got to the point where the sanitary and other conditions were that appalling that the Undue Subdivision Act put it at a limit of 16 perches or 400 square metres. And since then, we have done a lot of work to actually then go up, and there's been a series of legislative changes that have enabled us to keep moving up and up and up. And with that, the technology has also made sure. So with the street names, we essentially found that most of them were either, I'll say, matriarchal surnames or connected with the royalty. And
council.
And
council.
And council.
Mayors, aldermen.
Oh yeah,
council.
yeah. Sorry, and the administrators got a good,
yeah.
got a good look in. In a sense, then, from where we've got to, just to summarise, as far as the actual, I'll call it the footprint, our rate of energy use is estimated to be about 50 to 100 times the rate of any energy use of one of those First Nations people that were here in Brisbane. And our population is 175 times. So if you multiply 175 times 50 to 100, you get a big number. And that's our personal footprint now in Southeast Queensland. So essentially, we've moved Southeast Queensland into a metastable environment, a non-metastable environment. That is, we're very open because of so much population load. When things go wrong, they'll go seriously wrong. This, by the way, is a list of the legislation that's been introduced at various points over time to enable us to slice up. And slicing up for me now has a new meaning, because it doesn't mean you just slice on the ground, you slice up. So we now have titles in the sky, and that's a very effective way of getting people populated. And what we've also discovered is that Brisbane became Brisbane in 1925. They consolidated all of the councils. It took us from 1925 to 1965 to get our first town plan. And in the meantime, the business community got pretty frustrated with the apathy of Brisbane people. And essentially, based on the research that's being done by some well-credentialed economists, it would appear that those business interests still continue to exercise an enormous impact over our space. This is one example. It's from the 50s, where someone had a bright idea that they would convert part of Spring Hill, essentially demolish everything that was there and build a new part of the suburb. And then in 1980, the council did an extensive planning process and essentially was even more extreme. It was proposed to essentially, other than a little alcove near Victoria Street, to demolish virtually the whole of the suburb. And the dark bits you see on the map were up to 30 stories, and most of the other parts are up to 10 stories. And at the moment now, if you want to be able to act in Spring Hill to do something that might cause it to change, you need to understand that the Commonwealth Government is heavily involved in the process, that it then is connected with the state and regional plans, that's then connected to the city plans, that's then connected to the local plans. So for an individual to participate in influencing the way that the space is made, you need to make a lot of connections. The light pink ones there are the character housing areas. Essentially, the X's in the yellow bits and the black marking is all of the development that is to 30 stories. So at the moment, there are 350 stories of approved development that the developers are sitting and waiting for the incentives to come from government to just make it a little bit more profitable for them to proceed. But like most of the housing crisis, the main reason is that the commercial industry has got all of the approvals that it needs. It could build all of these buildings tomorrow. It just chooses not to. And that applies to subdivision of land. They're the yet to be built bits. And I don't know whether you can see it in the photos, but in a couple of them, you can see a house down in the bottom left or right-hand corner to give you some idea of they're the buildings that comprise. And that's what it means in a suburb like ours at times, where the person in the little house almost can't do anything to change their house, but it's possible to get a very large building pretty close next door. The demographics probably don't help us, and this is a quick snapshot of the Brisbane City Council's overlay of pre-1911 housing. I think, Bev, you've counted less than a dozen on their map. According to us, there's probably 100, 120. So I suppose they don't want to know about it. The dots on there, every week, there are 26 locations in Spring Hill where people are being provided with food. So on Tuesday afternoon, I was at a local church. We handed out food for 250 people. There are 25 other venues in Spring Hill that are providing food every week. That's what our particular way of development, that's one of the byproducts. And the byproducts are you cannot have this type of development without causing more homelessness and less affordability. And the demographics that we've done demonstrate that. Sitting behind all of what we've talked about, these are all hyperlinked, but they give you direct access to the material that supports it. I think that in terms of space, what I thought was worthwhile to mention is that we've been talking about actually dealing with turf and then the spreadsheets. There is a concept which is well established across the world called mobility as a service. And the intention is, and the Brisbane Lord Mayor is already piloting drones in terms of getting people to sporting events and all that sort of thing. Probably in some of our lifetimes, we will probably be leaving our apartment from the window as opposed from the lift. And in terms of naming and living somewhere, we will sort of be living in space. And this is the end. It's a quote from a French urbanist, and I'll leave it to you to read, but I'll say the key point is space is investment. The production of space has nothing incidental about it. It is a matter of life and death. And what he's essentially saying is, if you don't understand how we are creating this space, then you're going to be in an ordinary space sometime into the future. And in fact, what's very clear, if I go back to his first line, is that the very methods that were used to dispossess the First Nations people are the very methods currently being employed to dispossess the residents of Brisbane, because most of the planning is being done for people who don't live here. And essentially over time, the development process that is in play will cause us to have to move out. Some may say that's progress. And I think our objective is to make sure we start to understand how its system works, how we engage with it. It's an apolitical issue. It's not an issue about a red or a green or a blue or a black or a whatever. It's about ordinary life. So Bev has kindly provided lots of stuff if afterwards you want to walk around and look, and has also got an enormous amount of on-the-ground experience about what's been happening in Spring Hill. Would you like to have questions, or have I gone overboard that much that you have time?
No one's got up and walked out yet, you know. So great. Settle down, Phil. We'll have a few minutes out of a couple of questions, you know. But I'd sort of like to thank you anyway. And the maps that they've put up, they're worthwhile looking at. And the development, as I said at the beginning, they've done so much, you know, here. It's just hard to pack it down to an hour. What there is, but all those links will become available to where you can look at this stuff. And it's just hard to imagine how we're exploding out, and the information that is even there. Like there's a map that's fairly hard to read here, the Plumbers one, the Plumbers map over there. You know, in the Plumbers in the development, the house was also marked if it had the plague. Okay, so you knew what you were doing when you set out to do your work. You know, that back in the early 1900s, like you mentioned. So the work that they've done sort of is just volumes and in depth. But we'll take a couple of questions then anyway, if there's anyone got any questions. Bob, okay, go.
I used to be a town planner. I wouldn't say I'm one now. There's a conflict between the regional perspective of these people and the local perspective of groups like yourself. And you live close to a CBD. So the CBD takes over in the regional perspective. That's what they think, the way they think. Because I spent years in that profession, and I went back to my economic profession. I couldn't put myself an economist anymore. I've been retired too long. I couldn't forecast anything. That's real. And unfortunately, the professionals are all being trained at universities which are equally active.
Yeah, the multi-levels that he talked about earlier on do really add a lot of complications, you know, when we look at it, you know, from national down, and someone sitting in Canberra or whatever doesn't understand the people who are living on the streets of Spring Hill. And that's just a common battle we have to have. But but by gathering the knowledge together that they have, they got food to sort of fight with, sort of thing. But anyway, sorry.
So on if I could pick up on that point, a couple of things. Firstly, the Australian government has refused to introduce international money laundering controls over property, real estate, and law.
Yeah,
there are millions and millions of dollars of dirty money sitting in our system, and when you try to bring in legislation, they don't care. They can sit on it for ages. So putting it into, I'll say, corporate control, and Bev's reminded me, is that in the Kurilpa upzoning, Parmalat, Visi, the other corporate owners, essentially what the Lord Mayor has done is gifted them each probably somewhere between $50 and $100 million for nothing. Why? Because yesterday they could build 30 stories, today they can build 100. When it comes to affordable, as soon as they sell that block of land, they've got to, the developer has got to get a return on a block that's got to be able to afford that amount of payment for the land. We are creating the system by upzoning in the CBDs excessively and by not allowing more people to get engaged in the process across the suburbs. And the other element I'd add to that is virtually, you may have seen the crisis that's occurred as a result of PwC consulting to the Commonwealth and providing advice to corporates about how they could avoid Australian tax. In Queensland, currently, the firm that does all of the infrastructure planning for most of the businesses has been engaged by the state government. One of their staff is now running the SEQ regional plan, and they're anticipating spending $100 billion on infrastructure in the next 20 years. So the business interests are actually writing their own business plans because our governments don't have the capacity to do it themselves. And that makes it difficult.
An additional comment to that is there is a council subcommittee on the next city plan, and the primary members of that subcommittee are private developers. So they're the ones advising.
Another town planner up the back here. Yeah.
I have an ex-one who occasionally works involved with it. I was just wondering whether you were going to leave us your slides so that we can read the slides and reflect more on it, think more on it. Not so much the link. I mean, the links. Of course, other people will want that, but I know a lot of them as from being a town planner. So I was hoping that you'd leave the slides.
Yeah, they're all available. So they're on this computer, and I've also sent them to your office and said that they can, as well as the full report, if anyone is crazy enough to want to read the whole report.
Another question before we head for Smoko, and then we can you can spend your time over a cup of chatting with them. Another question? No? No? Yeah. Tongues are hanging out for a coffee or something.
Neville, thanks a lot for the opportunity, and I hope that it provides a perspective that you might otherwise not have got.
Yeah, I'm just sorry that we don't have enough time. As I said, you could probably talk 2 or 3 sessions before and after lunch to cover a lot of things that you've got. But thanks very much.